What's the most supernatural experience you've ever had? Story 1. Two stories. I was 14 or 15, sitting in our downstairs living room while my parents slept in their bedroom upstairs. It was around 1 a.m. or so, and I was on the computer playing a video game. The only light in the house comes from my computer screen and a lamp that's opposite me by the couch. Suddenly, I hear a man's voice say my name very plainly. Not a whisper, not a yell, just a mid-level call that sounds like it's coming from the darkened hall. I assume it's my dad, because sometimes he comes down the stairs and calls at me from the lower step to tell me to go to bed or whatever. I get up and go into the hallway, but no one's there. I look up the stairs, lower step, to tell me to get to bed or whatever. I get up and go into the hallway, but no one's there. I look up the stairs and call lightly out to my dad, but then I hear his telltale snores from upstairs. A bit weirded out, I go back to the computer. A minute later, I hear the voice call and say my name again, but this time it's as if the person speaking is right beside me, and the voice is a bit more assertive. I jump up and look in the direction of the voice. Nothing is there. Suddenly, the lamp across the room starts to hum. The light flickers and the light bulb explodes. I got pretty unnerved at that point. I turned on all the downstairs lights, cleaned up the burst bulb, and went upstairs to sleep. Second story. I was about 8 or 9 and was getting ready for bed in my room. I was sitting on my bed and taking off my socks when I suddenly got this overwhelming feeling that was being watched. I knew of the feeling, but had never experienced it myself. I felt for sure that something with bad intentions was standing over against the wall between my closet and my closed door, watching me. A feeling of terror watched over me, and I sat there for what felt like an hour, probably just a few minutes, staring at the floor, unable to move, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to look up, reasoning that what I was feeling was silly. I knew that once I looked up and saw that nothing was there, the feeling would go away. It didn't. I looked up and felt even more terrified. Nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had locked eyes with some malevolent, invisible force. After another, I looked up and felt even more terrified. Nothing was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had locked eyes with some malevolent, invisible force. After another minute, frozen, unblinking, I stood and made my way slowly toward the presence, trying to decide whether to bolt out the door. It was right beside it, or face it. I decided to approach it. Eventually, I felt as if I was face to face with whatever this thing was, and the feeling of a presence was as strong as ever. I raised my hand, paused, and then thrust it forward. I felt a bit surprised when my fist hit the wall. The feeling of being watched suddenly disappeared and I felt alone again. I never had that feeling ever again. One time, me and my husband were watching TV in our living room. He decided to kick his shoes off while sitting on the couch, and both shoes landed in front of the TV stand on the floor and on their sides. About 30 minutes into the TV show we were watching, one of the shoes, out of the effing blue, moved upwards by itself. I froze up on the couch, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband staring at his shoe looking startled. Then I said to my husband, "Did you see that?" He replied, "Yeah." My eyes started to get really huge, and he saw that I was about ready to flip out, and he said, "It's okay. Calm down, I'll burn some cedar." So then he did, and all felt well again. We're native, so we just smudged that hoe out of our house. Wow, those stories are really creepy. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been to hear someone call out your name when you're all alone in the house. And that feeling of being watched is just so unsettling. I'm glad nothing actually happened in either of those situations. But that last story about the shoe moving by itself is just too much for me. I can't imagine how scary it must have been to see that happen, right in front of your eyes. It's great that you and your husband have a way of dealing with those kinds of things that make you feel better. I hope nothing like that ever happens to me. Story 2. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house. Both of my parents worked long hours, so her place became like a second home. She was a tough old woman, rail thin but strong. Sometimes I'd watch her going about her routine and wonder if she was some kind of witch. She just had a witchy way about her. But of course, that might just be what resourcefulness looks like to a kid. Anyway, her house didn't help. It was old. Everything in it was old, and it was dark. I don't know how best to describe it other than to say I always felt like that being inside my grandma's house wasn't much different from being outside of it. In any season, the windows in the house would stay jammed open with old bent screens, which had to be shimmied into place with old slats from some discarded Louvre door. Grandma had this rusty potbelly stove right smack in the middle of her bedroom. I remember constantly dodging it as I ran through the house playing. At night, she'd load the stove with one great big chunk of hickory, and you could see the flames licking through the cracks. I'd lay on the floor with my sleeping bag, positioning myself so that the stove was in between me and Grandma's bed. Facing this direction meant that I could easily see through the window at the foot of her bed. It was like a nightlight for me. Everything in that house was black at night unless there was a window nearby. So there I lay one night. It was chilly, and I remember having trouble sleeping because the moonlight coming through the window was so bright. It was late, which meant that the stove wasn't roaring anymore. Besides my grandma's breathing, the whole house was dead silent. It was just the two of us. No one else was in the house. Without any warning, a tall, black figure calmly walked from the shadows at the far side of the room. He passed between the stove and bed, across the floor, just a foot from my head, and out through the doorway into the kitchen. I was petrified, couldn't move an inch. This may sound crazy, but had I felt like a burglar was in the house, I'd like to think I would have moved, or shouted or something. I didn't think it was a burglar though. No specific reason why. It just felt wrong. I don't think I fell asleep that night. All I remember is staring at the kitchen doorway for a long time. When my grandma woke up, she rolled out of bed and grabbed the fire poker. I sat up and began to tell her what I'd seen. Like I said, I always felt like my grandma was a little bit witchy. After I finished telling her about the tall man, she just poked at the coals in the stove and said, haven't seen him in a long time. I think a lot of us had grandparents or older relatives who had these kinds of spooky, old-fashioned houses that just felt a little bit creepy, but the part where the tall black figure calmly walked through the room is just bone-chilling. I mean, I can't even imagine how scared I would have been in that situation. And it's even weirder that your grandma wasn't all that surprised when you told her about it. Like, she had seen this tall man before? What the heck? Story 3. When I was between the ages of 4 to 6, I used to see a little blonde boy through this mirrored armor in my parents' bedroom. The armoire was big and wooden, but had mirrored accents and mirrors running all the way around the base. If I laid on the carpet in front of it and looked into the mirrors on the bottom, sometimes I'd see a little blonde boy in a red sweater in the corner of the room, far away and a little distorted, but still very clear. He would sit with his back to me, looking out the windows in the backyard. I don't remember ever seeing his face. I don't think I saw him many times, but I do remember his image very clearly. In my little kid mind, I thought I invented this super neat mirror trick by myself. I don't think I saw him many times, but I do remember his image very clearly. They always refused, and my mom especially would get super mad at me for asking. I stopped seeing the boy when I stopped playing in their bedroom as much, and knew mirrors shouldn't work like that. When I got older, I chalked it up to my overactive kid brain. Didn't think much of it, TBH. Years and years later, when I was an adult, and long after my parents had sold that house, my mom asked me about the armoire out of the blue, then told me that she used to see the little boy too. Not in the mirrors, but sometimes just out of the corner of her eyes. Like, she'd be cooking and catch a glimpse of blonde hair passing by her hips at a kid's height, and occasionally in dreams. It didn't happen too often, but just enough to deeply freak them out. So when I mentioned seeing this same little boy, my mom was just terrified herself. There was other strange stuff in that house, but this was 100% the most vivid I remember. It's interesting how our minds can play tricks on us as kids. I mean, you thought you had discovered this cool mirror trick all by yourself, but it turns out there was something much more mysterious going on. And the fact that your mom also experienced strange sightings just adds to the mystery. Maybe there really was a little boy haunting that armoire, or maybe it was just our imaginations running wild. But either way, it's a fascinating story that will definitely make me think twice about looking into mirrors in the dark. Story 4. My grandfather loves my grandmother a lot. He would constantly tell her she was beautiful and would always do embarrassing things to make her laugh. Unfortunately, she died a few months after being diagnosed with cancer. This affected him a lot, but as time went on, he came to terms with it. My grandfather lived on for another 18 years. In his final years, he developed really bad Alzheimer's that led him to forget that his wife had passed away, and would often call for her or ask us where she went. We explained to him that she'd passed away, but it always made him distressed and upset, so we decided to tell him she'll be back soon, every time he asked where she was. A month or so before my grandfather passed away, I was at his house with my mother, and we were all sitting in the living room. My grandfather, who was seated on his chair, all of a sudden started frantically asking us where my grandmother was. We calmly explained to him that she'll be back soon, and she was just out doing some chores. Unlike most times, he was persistent in wanting to see her. We explained to him again that she'll be back soon, but he kept getting more persistent. He frantically started to call out for her. He screamed her name as loud as he could over and over again until out of nowhere, every single door and window in the room flung open all at once. Now, we could say that it was just wind, but all the doors and windows in the house had secure locks and would stay locked at all times, since my grandfather would wander off or forget to lock his doors. All the doors and windows burst open, and at that same second, my grandfather, who was facing the front door, said, "What took you so long? I've been waiting for you," with a smile. My mother and I didn't see the person my grandfather talked to, but I'm sure that he saw his wife. Now, I'm not saying it was definitely a ghost or anything, but come on, that's some pretty creepy stuff. And the fact that the grandfather said, "What took you so long? I've been waiting for you," just adds to the spook factor. But you know what? I'd like to think that it was indeed the grandfather's wife who came back to visit him one last time. Maybe she wanted to let him know that she was still with him, even though she had passed away all those years ago. Story 5. My remote once jumped off the TV by itself. The old school box type of television, when I was watching with my girlfriend. Didn't fall or slide off. We actually saw it take a leap as if somebody threw it. We both just sat there being really confused before even questioning it out loud. These kinds of stories are always the creepiest for me. The ones where you have someone else there to verify it really happened and it wasn't your imagination. Not quite the same as your story, but I have a bunch of fairy lights set up in my room. Most of them are powered by USB and plug either into a spare plug or directly into the USB socket of my extension lead. I have one set of fairy lights that keep lighting up by themselves. Initially, it happened while they were plugged into the extension lead, but the lead was switched off, so it shouldn't have been possible. I didn't think much of it, but the second time it happened, I just took the USB lead out and left them totally unplugged. Since then, they have continued to randomly turn themselves on. And not just a brief flicker either. They are properly turned on and stay on. I've managed to capture it on video and show everyone they're unplugged too. My dad's an electrician, and he thought it might be that they're picking up residual energy. But when he saw the video, he was confused and said that they shouldn't be on for so long. Even weirder, I now keep waking up in the middle to a totally different set of fairy lights in my room being turned on, despite them being off when I fall asleep. Starting to wonder what's happening. But the fact that I can't brush it off as me just imagining it is definitely not helping. Story 6. I used to do pest control. Went to a customer's business for the first time. As I walked in the office, I noticed some pictures that were supposed to be hanging on the wall or on the ground, and then I saw some papers which looked like they'd been thrown and scattered off a desk. I picked everything up so I could apply treatment to the floorboards and surrounding rooms. I then went to the only restroom in the office. I simply knocked on the door as a courtesy, as I always do before entering any restroom. There was no reply because nobody was in there. So I went and applied for treatment in the restroom, and I closed the door behind me. As I walked away from the door, I know I heard somebody grab the door handle, twist it open, and open the door. I turned around and looked to see nobody behind me, but a door swinging open. The hair on my neck instantly stood up, and I put two and two together. I grabbed my shit and ran downstairs. The receptionist saw me and started laughing. She asked me if I had met their little friend upstairs. I mean, I don't blame you for getting the heck out of there as fast as possible. Who knows what kind of spooky ghost or haunted entity was lurking around in that office. But hey, at least you had a good laugh with the receptionist about it. I mean, their little friend upstairs. That's hilarious. It's always good to have a sense of humor about these kinds of things. Story 7. About a year ago, my coworker and I went to get coffee at a new coffee shop that opened up because of our work. I was dealing with a lot of anxiety over my future. Anyway, while in line, there was a woman in front of me. She was giving her order when she stopped mid-sentence and looked behind her to see me. She turns back around and gives the barista her order. After I give my order, she comes up to me and said, "Hey, I know this is gonna sound weird, but do you know a man named Jim?" Her words took me off guard because Jim was my grandpa. He died of cancer. He didn't live in the same state as I did, so I doubt he and the woman would have ever met. I told her yes, he was my grandpa, and she told me that he wanted me to know that I needed to stop worrying because everything was going to be okay. Cue me crying in the middle of the coffee store in front of my bewildered coworkers and a couple of strangers. Story 8. When I was 15, I woke up in the middle of the night and saw this strange spotlight appear on my wall. It was a circle made up of a bunch of bright circular dots within it. It came on strong, then rotated 90 degrees and then turned off. It was so surreal because the light was extremely bright, and yet it was also focused on that one spot on my wall. When I woke up the next morning, I couldn't get the image out of my head, but I just assumed I must have dreamed it. My sister and I were talking over breakfast and she said, "I had this dream last night that my entire room suddenly lit up with these circular dots floating around my room." I got really excited. That actually happened. I woke up and saw it too. My sister froze. How is that possible? My blinds are completely shut. Chills. To this day. Wow, that's definitely a spooky experience. It's always unnerving when strange things happen, especially in the middle of the night. And the fact that your sister had a similar experience, even though her blinds were completely shut, just adds to the creepiness factor. All we can do is hope that it was just a one-time occurrence and that you and your sister never have to experience anything like that again. But who knows? Maybe it's just the universe's way of reminding us that there's still so much we don't understand about the world around us. Story 9. I've posted about this before, but when I was about 9 years old, 1995, in the middle of a bright summer day, I went to the refrigerator to get a popsicle. Suddenly, a roughly teenage-looking guy with long brown hair, wearing a beige turtleneck and red plaid bell-bottoms, turned around the corner into the hallway to my left, then vanished from toe to head as I looked at him. Told no one about it for years, until after my mother mentioned meeting the now-grown kids who lived in the house before us, who asked her if she'd seen the bell-bottom ghost. Story 10. My best friend's dad, who was a second father to me, came to me in a dream and told me to tell my best friend that he loved her and that he was sorry. I woke up to my cell phone ringing to find it was my best friend, absolutely hysterical, telling me that he finally passed away from sclerosis. I sobbed all day. He was drunk our whole lives, but it still hurt. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.